Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, profiting doctors, of course, are in the news as they profit more from prescription drugs. Moscow's Patriarch and Constantinople are butting heads once again. And, of course, Putin on his thoughts of first strike in this war of words between nations. But first, we start with the drug company Insys, who manufactures fentanyl labeled Subsys, has an interesting compensation package for their sales reps who not only prescribe the drug, but get doctors to prescribe the strongest dose. Senator Claire McCaskill has been investigating this practice and has found that Insys reps are paid 5 times more if they get doctors to prescribe the most powerful dose of the drug. The payout is $283 for a 100 microgram prescription, all the way up to $1,830 for a 1,600 microgram dose. Now that payment, of course, goes to the reps, and that, of course, is the highest dose. Well, Insys also paid doctors for speaking events to boost prescription sales.
Well, some of the correspondence that were uncovered in company emails was, quote, own your territory, own your doctor, own your destiny, and the bigger the script, the more money you make, cha-ching again. Well, one woman who suffered chronic back pain after a fall while pregnant was prescribed Subsys, calling it a miracle drug and increasing her dosage from 200 micrograms to 1,200 micrograms in 8 months. When she finally quit the opioid, she said she was so sick. Now, to add insult to injury, the doctor received $41,000 to promote the drug made by Insys.
Wow. Dr. Scott Hadlin of the Boston Medical Center addiction specialist said they saw patients and doctors and they saw dollar signs. Well, Dr. Hadlin studied the financial incentives influence and how they influence doctors. And so, like he said, you know, these major pharmaceuticals, they see ways to boost their income by getting doctors and their representatives to sell larger portions of the drugs to unsuspecting patients who end up suffering in the end.
Yeah. Well, President Trump made a threat to shut down the southern border and send out the military in an attempt to stop a caravan of migrants from entering the U.S. Now, from Honduras to Guatemala on to Mexico, over 4,000 migrants are heading north with their hopes of entering the U.S. Now, they've accepted food and money from strangers along the way, saying that they're fleeing from violence from their own country, according to some, and others left with just the clothes on their backs.
Well, after entering Guatemala, Mexico is the next crossing where the government has deployed hundreds of soldiers sent to the border on Boeing 727s to deal with the influx. Well, many will be told to return, while others will be allowed to seek asylum. Geronimo Gutierrez is Mexican ambassador to the U.S. He said there is a humanitarian crisis going on and we need to call it what it is. But President Trump is lashing out at the caravan.
Now, since the president suspended his family separation policy, illegal border crossings have skyrocketed. Unpublished Border Patrol data shows that there were over 16,000 family members arrested in September, which was an 80% increase over July. Now, Border Patrol also told CBS News that they are swamped as more large groups are crossing together.
Wow. An official said that on September 20th, there were 275 adults and children who were encountered, and not too long after that, on October 2nd, there was an additional 164. White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and National Security Advisor John Bolton reportedly got into a shouting match at the White House over the administration's immigration policy. While on 60 Minutes, reporter Leslie Stahl asked the president if he'd return to the family separation policy. His response: when you allow the parents to stay together, referring to it the children, then people are going to pour into our country.
Well, these caravans happen all the time, migrants traveling in groups for safety. Now, in April, several hundred made it to the U.S. border near San Diego, and a limited number of those were allowed to apply for asylum in the U.S.
Well, Russia's investment in the U.S. Treasury bonds hit an 11-year low in May at $14.9 billion, down from $96.1 billion in March. The head of the Central Bank of Russia said that they are cutting their stack in U.S. Treasuries as the result of financial, economical, and geopolitical risk. In return, they have been buying up gold, with the latest estimates of their holdings at $80.5 billion, which overtake China as the biggest holder of gold.
Well, the U.S. has added to sanctions against entities that violate UN restrictions regarding North Korea. This time, sanctions were imposed on 2 Russia-based companies and 6 Russian vessels with punitive measures. Now, the U.S. Treasury Department said that it will continue to pressure Pyongyang until the regime achieves final and complete denuclearization. The accusations against the Russian vessels state that they transported petroleum products to North Korea vessels in violation to international sanctions.
Well, it confirmed that Russian vessels transported 3,500 tons of oil to North Korean vessels earlier this year. The buyer was North Korean Taesong Bank, which has already been slapped with sanctions by Washington for engaging in illicit economic activities for the regime. The sanctions will remain in place until Pyongyang achieves final, fully verifiable denuclearization. The U.S. Treasury Chairman said that those who violate UN restrictions will be sanctioned under U.S. law.
Well, this is the 3rd round of U.S. sanctions imposed by the Trump administration this month and comes ahead of the scheduled visit of U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's to Pyongyang. Now, these sanctions are seen as added pressure on the North.
We now turn it over to our field correspondent, Larry McGee, who has more information on some interesting things that are taking place with the Vatican and, of course, Constantinople and Moscow's leader of their religion there. What's taking place in the world of religion, Larry?
South Korean President Moon Jae-in is attempting to help heal relations between the Vatican and Pyongyang by arranging a sit-down between the two in the coming months. Analysts say that if he is successful, it will be the biggest achievement achieved so far in moving the isolated nation from a place of infamy and disrepute to a position of international acceptance. The pontiff visited South Korea in 2014 and was welcomed by a sea of 1 million people who lined the streets of Seoul. This can be attributed mostly to the fact that Christianity has been able to penetrate and take hold in the South, whereas in the North, there is only reported to be 4 churches, which are said to be more for show than any indication of genuine acceptance of Christianity there. President Mike Pence, in fact, stated recently that in its persecution of Christians, North Korea has no rival on earth. He described the government's behavior as unforgiving, systematic, unyielding, and often fatal. Kim Il-sung, one of the Kim dynasty's former leaders, attempted to receive a papal visit a few decades ago without success, and if his grandson Kim Jong-un is able to pull it off, observers say it will be another huge achievement for the DPRK in a year where it has seen quite a few diplomatic firsts. At first, it might have been difficult to see what was truly behind the conflict in the Ukraine, but as time moves on, a clearer picture is emerging, which has then shed light on the true motives behind the conflict. The Orthodox nation of Russia is said to have responded harshly to the recent Orthodox Christian Synod, where Ukraine's church leaders were given official recognition and plans were reportedly laid out to assist the Ukrainian church in ceding from its ecclesiastical union with Moscow. The push to win the Ukraine from Russia has 2 fronts, one religious, the other secular, and both with extreme ramifications. From the religious angle, Metropolitan Hilarion has stated that the Constantinople Patriarch has recognized the leaders of the split, thus legitimizing the split that existed for over a quarter century, and has therefore made it impossible for the Russian Orthodox to stay united with the Constantinople Patriarchate. The king or patriarch of the Moscow Church has already issued several warnings of severing ties with Constantinople. Analysts say that if he were to actually do so, then the Russian Orthodox Church would in effect be creating its own religion separate from Eastern Orthodoxy, which is currently aligned with Rome. On the secular side, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has stated publicly that Russia is willing to intervene and defend the interests of the Orthodox in Ukraine in the event that the course of events there begin to take an illegal turn. This worries some because they say it was that exact kind of rhetoric that preceded Russia's annexation of Crimea, and they are not confident that Moscow would manufacture incidents to legitimize further military action. There are reports that the Russian government also suspects American involvement in the matter in collusion with the Constantinople Patriarchate, but for now, the people of Ukraine, uncertain of Moscow's intentions, are simply waiting and watching to see what occurs next. It's one thing after another for the people of Syria, and the next thing now is chemical weapons reportedly being dropped by the U.S. In the Syrian town of Ajin and several others, America is said to have deployed white phosphorus, prompting the Syrian government to send a communication to the UN calling on the organization to take responsibility for ensuring peace and security throughout the world, to investigate and condemn the matter, and to prevent any further reoccurrences. The Geneva Convention prohibits the use of the chemical, but despite this, there are multiple reports of America and its coalition partners employing them, including allegations coming from Russia. And Hama, the residents speak concerning the infrastructural damage which has cost the country billions and decimated everything from transportation to agriculture. Citizens say in Raqqa, they struck them with white phosphorus bombs. In Jazara, they struck them with white phosphorus. In Tapka, they also use white phosphorus. And in Alsasa, phosphorus. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, Katan, I could see how the people there are very frustrated. It must be already difficult living in a war-torn country, and now with this phosphorus that is ruining their water and their food, that like the man said, it scorches their crops, so they can't even grow the food that they need to survive. So making an already difficult situation even worse.
That's right.
Well, worries about a new arms race between the United States and Russia has intensified. President Donald Trump claims Russia has been violating a 30-year-old treaty, and therefore he says the U.S. is going to, quote, terminate the agreement. But one Russian official warns breaking the pact would be a very dangerous step.
The year was 1987 when U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, met in Washington, D.C. to sign the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. The INF bans the U.S. and Soviet Union from possessing, producing, and test flying ground-launched missiles that have a range of around 300 to 3,400 miles.
Well, while President Trump can pull the U.S. out of the pact unilaterally, not everyone thinks it's a great idea. Republican Senator Rand Paul told Fox News, "I think it's a big, big mistake to flippantly get out of this historic agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev signed."
But Trump insists Russia is not honoring the agreement, so there's no reason for the U.S. to stay in it. Since 2014, the U.S. has been accusing Russia of being in violation of the treaty, saying they have been developing prohibited weapons. But Russia denies the charge and says the U.S. is the one developing the banned weapons.
Well, President Vladimir Putin addressed a large group of Russian officials recently, making this statement, quote, "The United States is in fact on the path to destroying the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They are continuously looking for violations on our part, but in fact, they do it themselves systematically."
As they've already mentioned, we, the U.S. have registered further attempts to break strategic parity by deploying the global missile defense system, as well as non-nuclear strike systems that can be compared to nuclear weapons. The strike capabilities are almost as precise as those of nuclear weapons. Why do they need such weapons? I believe there's only one reason: for blackmail, he said.
Well, John Bolton, the president's national security advisor, traveled to Moscow to talk about the treaty's future. There is definitely a divide among the European community on Trump's proposal. Germany has its concerns, but Britain's defense secretary told the Financial Times that his country stands, quote, absolutely resolute with the U.S.
Well, Trump is taking a firm stance, telling the press Russia has not adhered to the agreement. This should have been done years ago. Until people come to their senses, we have more money than anybody by far. We'll build it up until they come to their senses, and when they do, then we'll all be smart and we'll all stop. And by the way, not only stop, we'll reduce, which I would love to do, but right now they have not adhered to the agreement. So basically, they're not doing what they're saying they're going to do, so then we're not going to do what we said we're going to do.
Right. Well, when asked who Trump was directing the threat towards, he replied, it's a threat to whoever you want, and it includes China and it includes Russia. So the American president has also lumped China under the same treaty, saying they are not upholding it either. But ironically, Katan, they were never involved in the treaty. It was only the U.S. and Russia.
Right, that's right. Well, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson did respond to Trump's comments, describing his demands as unreasonable, making this statement. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is a treaty signed by the United States and the former Soviet Union. It is a bilateral treaty. It is totally unreasonable to make an issue out of China on withdrawing from the treaty. So stop using us as your scapegoat, basically.
Well, she continued, China always upholds a national defense policy that is defensive in nature and firmly safeguards its legitimate security interests. We will by no means accept any kind of blackmail. We would like to urge the U.S. not to move against the trend and think twice before taking any actions.
Well, with all the threats going back and forth, it's no wonder, Jeff, that a poll conducted this month, which actually found 46 of U.S. troops believe that the U.S. will be drawn into a new war within the next year. Now, that's up from 5% just a year ago of troops that thought that. Over 40 right now.
Right, and that is a pretty large increase there.
Is.
And there you can see they are preparing for war. They're getting it ready.
Sure.
Well, part of the reason for this could have to do with the NATO exercise Trident Juncture, which began October 25th. Now, tens of thousands of troops complete with warships and planes arrived for the drills in Norway, which borders Russia. NATO Secretary General Hans Stoltenberg addressed the NATO community saying, this is an important day because Trident Juncture is NATO's biggest exercise since the end of the Cold War. The scenario is fictitious, but the lessons we learn will be real.
The Russian defense minister has expressed his concern about NATO's military drills, saying NATO's military activity at the borders of Russia has reached an unprecedented post-Cold War level. The scope of operational military training at our borders is expanding and becoming more intense. He goes on to say that the goal is for NATO to have a larger capability to quickly deploy troops across Europe.
Well, when asked by RT France whether NATO drills in Europe risked a third world war, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, I believe everyone will be wise enough to prevent that. However, we are certainly very much concerned about the total absence of any professional dialogue between the Russian military and NATO.
Mr. Lavrov also said all cooperation between Russia and NATO has been frozen since the Western military alliance severed ties with Moscow in 2014, well, after the Crimean Peninsula reintegration with Russia in a referendum, which we reported on that as well. Lavrov's fear is that an accidental incident could trigger a confrontation between NATO and Russia. And I remember that was one of Russia's big concerns, several years ago,
Right.
as they started to see that buildup of troops around their border.
Right. And even this part about the accidental starting it, that has been in the news before. We've
Yes, it
covered there
has.
where people are concerned that this nuclear war may start accidentally if somebody does something and before you know it, the missiles are launched.
That's right.
Well, finally, Russian Vladimir Putin told an audience in Russia that Moscow has no plans to make a preemptive first strike using nuclear weapons. He also said that the Russian people will go to heaven as martyrs because they will be victims of aggression in the case of a nuclear attack. He added it wouldn't be the same for those who chose to commit those who launched the attack against them, promising they would not have time to repent before Russia strikes back. And interesting there, Katan, you can kind of see a timeline in a nuclear war. Yisrael Hawkins has been mentioning so much about the 1 hour.
Right.
In 60 minutes, you could have all-out nuclear war. And really, what Russian President Vladimir Putin did was actually just confirm that it will be so quick.
Right.
The missiles will be launched, and everybody's going to retaliate. And once they're up there, it's going to be a matter of minutes, and
Yep.
the Earth could be destroyed.
That's right. And you can see even with the statement that even though people in his country will be the victim, he, along with other leaders, are not planning to just turn the other cheek. They're
Right.
not going to just sit back and be victims. They're going to go ahead and strike back to show their force and that they will not be taken advantage of.
Well, hopefully people will use some common sense and not allow that to occur, but we know the prophecy does show different.
That's right.
If you'd like to learn more about these stories and others, you can contact the House of Yahweh, and when you do, don't forget your free copy of the Prophetic Word magazine and monthly newsletter. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can also call them at 1-800-613-9494 or visit them on any of their websites by going to Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to YPNnews.com. You can email the House of Yahweh at info@yahweh.com. For all calls outside the United States, please dial the number on your screen. And don't forget to check out the Yisrael Says and Ask Yisrael programs, which are online resources that you can find that will assist you in your study of the Holy Scriptures and Bible prophecies. Those are free programs to you, and you can find those by going to YisraelSays.com and AskYisrael.com.
Well, don't go anywhere. Up next is another exciting message from Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.